East Wind, East Wind by Nathan Peters. And the Lord said, Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. Go to, let us go down, and there confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. Genesis 11:6-7. Chapter 1. How long are you going to be gone? Lorelei asked. She held their baby in the crook of her right arm, bouncing it as she followed Mason toward the front door. Mason didn't answer. He kept walking. Mason! He opened the door and stepped outside without looking back, pulling it shut behind him. I'll see you in a few hours, he called over his shoulder to the closed door, ignoring the curses and protests that followed from inside the house. A white panel van sat in the driveway. Across its side, faded lettering read, Draper City Maintenance. A man with thinning blonde hair sat behind the wheel. He was older than Mason, maybe early 30s, overweight, with pockmarked cheeks. Mason opened the passenger door. It creaked with rust and age. As he climbed in, the driver frowned. How's it going, Jeff? Jeff's frown deepened. I hope you didn't tell her where we were going this time. Not a word. Jeff studied him for several seconds, his eyes searching Mason's face for any sign of deception. Mason stared back without expression. Satisfied, Jeff nodded and shifted the van into reverse. As they backed into the street, Mason glanced toward the house. Lorelei's angry face glared at him through the front window. He sighed. Jeff shifted into drive and sped away. A rustling sound came from the back of the van. Mason turned around. The cargo area was mostly empty. A large black duffel bag sat against one wall. It was a bag Mason knew well. Inside were the tools of his trade, a collection of rifles and handguns with the corresponding ammunition and 5 backpacks. Make that 6, Mason thought. 6 because of a recent addition to their crew. This was the person who sat beside the large duffel bag, a young man staring at him with wide, anxious eyes. Mason blinked. The kid was someone he'd met once before. Wesley, a recruit. Too young, too scared. In Mason's opinion, he had no business being on a job like this. Wesley? Mason said. Hey, Wesley said in response. The response was barely audible over the engine. He even sounds scared, Mason thought. Turning back around, Mason focused on the road ahead. He could feel Jeff watching him from the corner of his eye. Rather than meet the gaze, he studied the scenery rolling past the passenger window. Jeff's recruiting of Wesley had already sparked one argument between them. Mason hadn't wanted another crew member. With Wesley on board, there would now be 6 of them. Everything is now split 6 ways instead of 5. And he's too young. He understands the irony. Mason was only 23. Wesley was 19. It didn't change his opinion. Where is everyone? Mason asked, deciding to change the subject before another argument started. Jeff waited until he had changed lanes and passed a slow-moving Volkswagen before answering. We're meeting them at Thomas and Veronica's place. Mason glanced at him, then looked away. Jeff noticed. What? Nothing. Man, you let her get to you too much. Mason frowned. I don't trust her. By her, he meant Veronica Flores. Jeff sighed. I don't trust her either, but she's got the connections. We need her. Yeah, with a bunch of murdering thugs in Mexico. Well, said Jeff, beggars can't be choosers. Mason snorted in derision. Jeff, have you ever considered that just maybe Veronica could use us just as much as we are using her? Jeff took his eyes away from diving long enough to look at Mason as if he were an idiot. Duh, Mason, of course she is. I don't just mean with the certificates. I mean with her own position among her people in Mexico. Why has she been so adamant that we never talk to them ourselves? Why can't we meet her contacts? Jeff sighed again. This was an old argument between them. Though Jeff had known Veronica for longer than he had known Mason, Jeff seemed to know almost nothing about her. It was something he had voiced was fine with him. Knowing her would be like getting to know an old whore. It's going to be stories you wish you had never heard. TMI was something he said many times in their discussions about her. Mason had learned enough to know the connections meant the Sinaloa cartel. Without them, The security certificates they stole would be worthless, little more than expensive pieces of silicon and glass. Jeff was right. They needed Veronica. What Mason couldn't figure out was why Veronica herself needed to be part of their crew. "What are you trying to say?" Jeff asked. "You want her out?" Jeff quickly glanced back at Wesley when he said this, knowing they were venturing into a subject best not discussed in front of someone who hadn't really earned his trust yet. "No, I'm not saying that. I just don't understand her angle," Mason said. "A group like the cartel could pull jobs better than us. Why use a middleman?" "I don't know," Jeff said. "Maybe it saves them from bringing their own people up here. Less risk for them. Who knows? You're overthinking it. It's working, so who cares?" Mason didn't answer. The van rolled on in silence as they crossed into Salt Lake County and approached the southern edge of Draper. "Hey guys," said Wesley from the back. Mason turned his head to see him. The kid still looked scared. "Why is this baby with us?" thought Mason. Wesley seemed to sense Mason's disapproval. He avoided eye contact and directed his question toward Jeff. "Are you sure about this van?" he asked. "How are we not going to draw attention? Doesn't this thing stand out?" He hesitated, obviously wanting to say more, but feeling intimidated under Mason's scrutiny. He struggled for a few seconds more, then continued. "And it's not automated. I think it's only the third non-automated vehicle I've ever seen." Mason looked at Jeff. "Haven't you told him anything?" Jeff took his eyes off the road long enough to shoot Mason a sharp look. "I barely had time to pick him up before getting you. I had maybe 5 minutes." Mason almost argued. Bringing someone on a job without explaining the most basic procedures bordered on stupidity, but the look in Jeff's eyes convinced him to let it go. For now, the kid was already here. All they could do was keep him alive and hope he didn't get anyone arrested or killed. After the job, though, Jeff was going to hear about it. Jeff was a good leader, smart, ambitious. The money they'd made over the years proved that. Unfortunately, his ambition sometimes outran his common sense. Mason turned back toward Wesley. "There's no way we could transport thousands of stolen security certificates in a vehicle connected to the network," he said. "It has to be something offline, something old." He tapped the dashboard. "Like this." Wesley frowned. "Why? They haven't activated the certificates yet, have they? Why would it matter what vehicle they're in?" Mason stared at him. "He's not just young, he's clueless." "It matters," Mason said. The condescension in his voice was impossible to hide. Wesley's expression tightened. Embarrassment, maybe offense. Mason didn't care which. "The moment those certificates leave a designated storage facility, an alert goes out. It doesn't matter if they're not activated. They're still traceable." Wesley listened intently. "Any network-connected vehicle carrying stolen certificates gets flagged immediately. Best case, the vehicle shuts down. Worst case, we're locked inside until law enforcement arrives." He patted the dashboard again. "That's why we need something that isn't connected to anything." The rust, the rundown condition of the old van could be a turnoff, but it had become a source of comfort. It was as if the van resisted along with them, helping them reach their goal to circumvent the rigid life others had set for them, the past fighting the present. Wesley nodded as if he understood. Mason doubted it. If he had really understood, he would have asked the obvious question. Why are we allowed to drive this thing at all? Manually operated vehicles had been illegal on public roads for over 5 years. That was the question he should have asked. The answer was Veronica, or more specifically, the people behind Veronica, the cartels. Over decades, the Mexican cartels had accumulated immense wealth and influence. They'd started with narcotics, but long after America's failed war on drugs ended, their power remained. In some places, it had grown. From Capitol Hill to local police departments, cartel money had bought access, influence, protection, and most importantly, codes. Codes that were normally reserved for government agencies and law enforcement. Mason didn't fully understand how the system worked. Few people did. He understood it the same way most ordinary citizens understood electricity, enough to use it, not enough to explain it. The codes acted like keys. They unlocked portions of the network that controlled nearly everything: vehicles, infrastructure, communications, drones, millions upon millions of drones. The thought made Mason glance skyward through the windshield. Blinking navigation lights filled the sky. Thousands of them. Most were small, about the size of dinner plates. Others were much larger. Cargo drones could reach 15 feet in diameter. Passenger drones were often twice that size. Mason had always wished they could use them. A drone would be faster, quieter, and far more flexible than a van. Theoretically, they could use several at once. But in reality, it was impossible. Every operational drone had to remain connected to the network. A manually controlled drone was technically workable, but flying one safely through crowded airspace without AI help was another matter entirely. People had tried, usually teenagers, usually with disastrous results. Everyone had seen the stories. A bored kid steals the family drone. A collision follows. Another funeral. Mason and Jeff had discussed the idea more than once before abandoning it. Ground travel was safer, and thanks to Veronica's connections, it was possible. Automated roads still require occasional human maintenance. Machines handled most repairs, but not all. Certain specialized tasks still demanded human technicians. Few, and probably not for much longer. 5 years, Mason guessed. Maybe less. But for now, manually operated maintenance vehicles still existed. The system recognized them and rerouted the automated traffic accordingly. Using cartel-issued authorization codes, Mason's crew could masquerade as one of those maintenance teams. The codes didn't make them invisible, but they came close. Suddenly, Jeff pointed through the windshield. There we go. Ahead stood the apartment complex where Thomas and Veronica lived. It was one of dozens built through federal housing subsidies after the economic collapse of the 2020s. Most residents had lost homes, jobs, or both. Mason had spent part of his teenage years in a place just like it. Jeff exited Bangerter Expressway and pulled into the parking lot. He parked beside a gray Honda Civic. Mason scanned the lot. Empty. No sign of the others. Jeff sighed heavily. I swear, he muttered, if those idiots are still asleep, I'm going to shoot both of them. Mason glanced at him. With Jeff, it was difficult to tell whether something was a joke. He'd seen the man kill for less. What about Jasmine? Mason asked carefully. Wasn't she supposed to meet us here too? Jeff stared through the windshield. His face was expressionless. That worried Mason more than anger ever did. Over the years, he'd learned something about Jeff. The quieter he became, the closer he was to violence. Yeah, Jeff finally said. Running late as usual? His voice sounded flat and mechanical, like an automated customer service recording. Jeff opened his door. Let's go see what the problem is. Chapter 2. Mason nodded, and the three of them climbed out of the van and headed into the apartment complex. The complex comprised several identical 25-story towers. White monoliths rose into the sky, their rooftops bristling with antennas and drone ports. Hundreds of drones buzzed in and out of the buildings at all hours. A loud mechanical whine overhead drew Mason's attention upward. A delivery drone passed only a few feet above them, carrying a metal cargo container bound for one of the apartments. Over 10 others flew across the sky in all directions. Mason looked away from the drone just in time to avoid walking into Jeff's back. Jeff had halted. Yeah, he said. Mason and Wesley exchanged confused looks. Who is he talking to? Whispered Wesley to Mason. Mason shrugged and looked around, hoping no one noticed them, perhaps remembering their descriptions for later. He saw a few people. Some children were playing soccer with each other, a mother walking with a toddler in tow, a few older residents, possibly on a walk. None of them paid any attention to the three of them. We just got here, Jeff continued. A frown crossed his face. How long? His gaze drifted upward toward the roof of the building ahead. A faint blue light glowed inside his ear, showing his phone connection was active. We'll wait, but only until 10. Get here by then, or we'll leave without you. Jeff tapped his earlobe, ending the call, and resumed walking. Who was that? Mason asked. That idiot Jasmine, Jeff said. Her car's dead. She's taking an Uber. Mason frowned. He didn't like that. The network permanently connected an Uber. That meant there would be a digital record of her movements, a record showing she'd come here. Jeff didn't seem concerned, so Mason kept his thoughts to himself. They reached Thomas's apartment, and Jeff knocked on the door. A few seconds passed. Music thundered from inside, vibrating through the walls. The door swung open. A wave of marijuana smoke and cheap liquor blasted into the hallway like a physical force. All three men recoiled. Standing in the middle of the smoke was Veronica Flores. She wore pink panties and a black bra that barely covered her chest. Dark circles hung beneath her eyes and exhaustion sagged across her face. In heavily accented English, she spoke. "What do you three pendejos want?" Jeff frowned. Mason fought back a grin. He was fairly certain he was about to witness a fight. "What are you talking about, moron?" Jeff snapped. He pushed past her and entered the apartment. "Why aren't you ready to go?" His voice trailed off as he took in the apartment. The place looked like a tornado had twisted its way through. Empty bottles littered every available surface. Fast food containers overflowed from trash bags and covered the floor. Veronica noticed his expression immediately. Her face darkened. "Who you callin' moron, pendejo?" Veronica asked. Her tired face now tightened into anger. Jeff turned toward her with an expression of bored contempt. Then he shoved her again. Veronica stumbled backward and landed hard on the floor. "Ugh!" A deep male voice boomed from somewhere farther inside the apartment. "What's the problem?" Everyone turned. Thomas stood at the end of a hallway. He was a large black man in his late 30s, dressed only in white boxer shorts. Standing over 6 feet tall, he possessed the broad shoulders and muscular frame of someone who spent considerable time in a gym. Jeff stared at him for a moment before finding his voice. "The problem, Thomas, is that you two idiots were supposed to be ready when I got here." Jeff gestured around the apartment. "Instead, I find you standing around in your underwear, smelling and living like low-life street trash." Mason smiled again to himself, amused. Wesley looked apprehensive, his eyes darting between Jeff and Veronica. Thomas's face hardened from Jeff's words. Visibly angered, he strode quickly down the hallway toward Jeff, then halted, his eyes large with surprise. Jeff screamed. Veronica had struck out like a rattlesnake and kicked Jeff squarely in the groin. Jeff dropped to one knee, clutching himself. His teeth clenched. His face turned crimson. "You crazy whore," he hissed. Veronica glared down at him with equal parts rage and triumph and asked, "Who's the idiot now?" "Veronica, cut it out!" Thomas shouted. Jeff sucked in several painful breaths before slowly climbing back to his feet. "Who does this gringo think he is?" Veronica snapped. "He comes barging into my apartment and pushes me around." She shot Thomas a venomous look. "And you just stand there, you should stomp him." Still holding himself protectively, Jeff limped toward the front door. When he reached it, he turned back toward them and said to Thomas while eyeing Veronica, "I suggest you get your little Mexican pit bull under control." Veronica muttered something under her breath and started toward him. "Cut the shit!" Thomas roared. Mason and Wesley immediately stepped into the kitchen to get out of the way as Thomas crossed the room in 3 long strides. He wrapped his arms around Veronica from behind and pinned her arms to her sides. She exploded, kicking, twisting, spitting out an angry stream of Spanish. Thomas grunted with effort as he struggled to hold on to her. "Stop it!" he shouted in her ear. Veronica answered with a growl and drove her heels into his shins. Thomas cursed, then lifted her completely off the floor. Mason stepped clear of the two struggling people with a mixture of amusement and concern. Thomas was muscular, tall and strong, so much so that he looked as if he could accidentally snap her spine. By now, Jeff had recovered enough to stand upright. He sauntered toward the struggling pair. When he reached them, he stopped directly in front of Veronica. "Veronica." His voice was calm, almost gentle. Veronica continued struggling for another second before finally meeting his eyes. Everything changed. The anger vanished. The hatred disappeared. Concern replaced it. Then fear. Her eyes widened. Spittle clung to the corners of her mouth. Suddenly, she looked less like a furious criminal and more like a child who knew punishment was coming. Jeff leaned forward until his face was inches apart. "You decide right now," he whispered. The softness of his voice made the threat more frightening. "You get control of yourself and be part of this job, or I'm done with you." Nobody in the room misunderstood what he meant. When Jeff was done with someone, they stopped breathing. Veronica knew that better than anyone. She had spent most of her life surrounded by violent people. She recognized killers when she saw them. A faint smile appeared on Jeff's face. He watched as fear settled deeper into her expression. "You're smart, Veronica." He straightened. "You'll make the right choice." Jeff turned away and walked into the kitchen. Pulling out a stool beside the breakfast bar, he eased himself onto it and winced. Veronica sagged in Thomas's grip. She blew a strand of hair from her eyes and gave a small nod. "See?" Jeff said. "She's smart." Thomas didn't look convinced. He kept his hold on her. For an instant, Veronica's eyes gleamed with fresh anger as she attempted to break free. The effort failed. The fire disappeared just as quickly as it had come. Defeated, she looked at Jeff. "Can Thomas let me go now?" Jeff nodded toward Thomas. Thomas loosened his grip enough for her to slip free. Veronica rubbed her arm and stared at the floor. "Okay then," Jeff said pleasantly. "Let's discuss what needs to happen." Thomas took a few steps back, but never completely relaxed. His eyes remained fixed on Veronica, the way a person watches a dog known to bite. It was a good thing that Veronica was important to Jeff, Mason mused. Otherwise, the walls would be covered with her brains right now. Thomas shifted his attention away from Veronica and looked at Jeff. "I need you to get dressed, gather your gear, and be outside in the van within 5 minutes." Jeff's voice remained calm and pleasant. His eyes did not. Cold blue. No nonsense, no mirth. Thomas nodded. "Got it." Without another word, he headed for the bedroom, leaving Veronica alone with Jeff, Mason, and Wesley. "Veronica." She slowly raised her eyes. "I want the same thing from you," Jeff said, "and I want to know we will not have any more problems today." His voice hardened slightly. "You're lucky I didn't put a bullet in your head." Veronica's jaw tightened. Her teeth ground together. For a moment, Mason thought she might say something stupid. Jeff met her stare without blinking. Eventually, Veronica looked away. Then she nodded. Without a word, she turned and disappeared into the bedroom after Thomas. The three men watched her go. When she was gone, Jeff winked at Mason. Mason managed a faint smile. Then he glanced down the hallway again. "We need her," Jeff whispered. Those cold blue eyes had returned. "You're the boss," Mason declared. Jeff studied him for a second. Then he winked again. "Yeah," he said, "I am." The room fell silent. A few minutes later, Thomas and Veronica emerged from the bedroom. Thomas now wore jeans and a gray t-shirt. In his right hand, he carried a small green backpack. Veronica carried nothing. She had changed into black leggings and a cropped white t-shirt that exposed a flat, muscular stomach. The sleeves had been cut away at the shoulders. "That's more like it," Jeff said. He pointed toward Thomas. "You have the descrambler?" Thomas smirked. "I wouldn't be standing here if I didn't." Jeff nodded. "Oh, how foolish of me to doubt either of you." The sarcasm was impossible to miss. Veronica responded with a sneer. Jeff ignored it. "Let's move." Veronica opened the apartment door and stepped into the hallway. As she passed, Jeff turned toward Thomas. "Is she going to be okay?" Thomas looked genuinely offended by the question. "Veronica is always ready to go." He jerked a thumb toward the door. "Just because you can't see it doesn't mean it ain't there." Thomas headed into the hallway. He stood just past the door and looked at Jeff. "How about us? We ready?" he asked Jeff. Jeff shrugged. "Good enough," responded Jeff. He followed Veronica outside. Mason went next. Thomas brought up the rear, locking the apartment door behind him. The roar of traffic from Bangalore Expressway filled the air as they crossed the parking lot toward the van. A lone woman stood beside the passenger side sliding door. She was smoking. Tobacco, Mason guessed. Although with Jasmine, it could have been almost anything. Jasmine was the crew's supplier of every mind-altering substance imaginable. She was in her 20s, attractive, and possessed almost platinum blonde hair that fell to her shoulders. Her build was lean and athletic, the result of countless hours spent on treadmills and dance-based workouts. As they approached, Jeff cursed. "What is wrong with you?" Jasmine blew smoke through her nostrils and looked at him in confusion. "What? Why are you standing out here in the open?" Jeff's eyes darted upward. A drone hovered several hundred feet above the parking lot. He glanced away from it and glared at her. "Get in the van." Jasmine moved immediately. Thomas chuckled as he climbed inside. Veronica followed without saying a word, her body language still radiating contempt for everyone around her. Jeff shook his head. Mason answered with a sympathetic smile. It was a pretty stupid mistake on Jasmine's part. Every drone, every vehicle, practically every streetlight had a camera on it somewhere, collecting information and recording faces. Mason walked around to the passenger side and climbed in. A moment later, Jeff slid behind the wheel. Chapter 3. Okay, I want everyone to be professional this time, Jeff said. The van sat parked outside a closed security gate. Beyond the gate stood a large warehouse, surrounded by a concrete wall. The building itself appeared plain, painted blue and white with no sign of what it stored inside. Mason knew exactly what was in there. Electronic components, drone parts, computer hardware. None of it mattered. The only merchandise he cared about was the security certificates. Over the previous 2 weeks, he and Jeff had studied the warehouse schematics until they practically knew the building by heart. 63 storage rows. Row 23, halfway down, third shelf from the top. 2 days ago, workers stored 7 pallets of certificates there. Each pallet contained 48 cases. Each case held 300 certificates. They couldn't take all 7 pallets. There wasn't enough time. There wasn't enough room in the van. 3 pallets were the goal. 43,200 certificates. Mason's pulse quickened. Split 6 ways. Not 5. 6. He did the math again. 7,200 certificates each. Even at a conservative black market value of $2,000 per certificate, nearly $15 million for each member of the crew. The thought made his stomach flutter. What are you doing? Jeff's voice snapped him back to reality. Mason looked up. Everyone in the van was staring at him. Jeff looked particularly irritated. Sorry, Mason said. Just thinking. Jeff snorted. How about you think about what we're doing? The words sounded casual. The eyes didn't. Yeah, sorry. Jeff turned toward the others. As I was saying, none of that my first through the door crap like last time. You all looked like a bunch of Keystone cops. Mason did not know what a Keystone cop was, but apparently nobody else cared enough to ask. Everyone nodded. Everyone except Veronica. She continued staring through the windshield. Jeff watched her for several seconds. Nothing. Not even a glance. His annoyance became visible. Thomas. What's up? Thomas asked. Come, look at this. I can't get the system to recognize the prompt. For the past 5 minutes, Jeff had been trying to disable the warehouse security network and open the gate. So far, he'd accomplished nothing. The mounting frustration inside the van had been obvious. It was part of what had allowed Mason's thoughts to drift toward future riches. Thomas squeezed between Wesley and Jasmine and moved to the front. Resting on Jeff's lap was a thin, rectangular device roughly the size of a tablet. Its screen displayed several windows filled with strings of numbers, command prompts, and system data. The device was what Thomas nicknamed his Descrambler, a simple name for an extremely sophisticated piece of hardware. Thomas had worked in cybersecurity before automation rendered his profession obsolete. When Thomas reached the front, Jeff pointed toward a screen in the lower right corner. Right there. I keep entering the certificate protocol and it just spits this code back at me. I can't make sense of it. Thomas studied the display. Which key did you use? The one you gave me. Thomas frowned. Try it again. Jeff stared at him. Why? I've already done it 6 times. Do it anyway. Muttering under his breath, Jeff entered the code again. The screen flashed red with the same error message. See? Jeff snapped. You gave me the wrong code. We drove all the way out here for nothing. Thomas frowned. I gave you 2 codes. Jeff's eyes narrowed. So? Which one did you use? The one you gave me. Several people in the van exchanged uneasy glances. Jeff's voice was sharpening. Thomas reached over and calmly took the device from his lap. Ignoring Jeff's increasingly hostile stare, he tapped several commands into the virtual keyboard. A second later, the red warning screen disappeared. Green replaced it. Thomas handed the device back. A smug grin spread across his face. You were entering the exit protocol. Jeff stared at him. The what? The exit protocol, not the entrance protocol. Thomas chuckled. We're lucky the system didn't flag us and send security drones. The grin widened. Jeff accepted the device without speaking. Thomas winked at Jasmine and worked his way back toward the rear of the van. Jeff watched him go, his face showing anger and frustration. The look in his eyes made Mason uneasy. Jeff, he knew, was on the verge of doing more than just talk, more than just glare. "Should we move in?" Mason asked. He wanted Jeff focused on the job, not on Thomas. The last thing they needed was some stupid alpha male argument, or something worse. "Not yet." Jeff continued staring at Thomas's back. "We need to give the shutdown sequence time to finish." Finally, he turned toward Mason. Something about his expression increased Mason's apprehension. A strange intensity, an instability. For the first time, Mason wondered if Jeff was cracking. The thought left a knot in his stomach. Jeff could be ruthless. He could be cold. But he'd always been reliable. There had been plenty of jobs where panic threatened to tear the crew apart. Jeff had always been the one who kept everyone focused. The anchor, the leader. Jeff glanced down at the device, then smiled. "There we go." The smile looked genuine, almost cheerful. "Gear up." He stood and raised his voice. "The system's down. We're going in." Immediately, Mason felt the familiar rush of adrenaline. It happened before every job. He never understood why. As long as their stolen credentials remained valid, automated security systems would ignore them, and they carried enough weapons to discourage most human opposition. The odds were in their favor. Still, his pulse raced. "Relax," he told himself. "You're about to become a rich man." The crew began collecting equipment, weapons, tools, bags. Thomas slipped another electronic device into a shoulder pack. It resembled the Descrambler but served a singular purpose. A last resort, an insurance policy. If the warehouse security system somehow came back online while they were inside, they could activate the device as an improvised EMP. The blast would destroy every CPU within roughly 30 yards, including any security certificates they had already stolen. It was the option you used only when the alternatives were prison or death. After everyone had gathered their gear, they looked to Jeff for the order to move out. Jeff studied each of them as if assessing their state of mind before the job. His gaze lingered longest on Thomas, perhaps waiting for a challenge or some sarcastic remark. None came. Thomas met Jeff's stare without expression. His mouth remained firmly shut. He didn't even offer the smirk he usually flashed whenever Jeff tried to intimidate him. Satisfied, Jeff nodded. "Okay." He pushed his way toward the rear doors of the van. "I'll go first, with Mason behind me," Jeff said. Then Wesley, Veronica, and Thomas bringing up the rear with the EMP. He glanced at Thomas. The malice was gone from Jeff's eyes. Now that the job was beginning, he was all business. Mason suspected the bad blood between them would resurface later when it came time to divide the haul. He slung his AR-15 over his shoulder and followed Jeff to the back of the van. Jeff placed a hand on the rear door handle and looked over his shoulder. "I'm heading straight for the gate. Everyone stay tight behind me." "Just go already," Veronica said, sounding bored. "How many times have we done this?" Jeff ignored her. He pulled open the door and jumped out. Mason was right behind him. The rest of the crew followed. They sprinted across the lot in single file toward the gate. Jeff stopped beside a gray metal control box mounted near the entrance. Attached to it was a push-button control panel. The thing looked ancient. They likely installed the panel in the early 2000s, well before most of them were born. Jeff opened a small metal access door beside the control panel. The hinges squeaked in protest. Mason guessed it had been years, maybe decades, since anyone had used it. The rest of the crew stood watch while Jeff worked. He tapped several commands into the device in his hand. A moment later, he smiled. The control panel mounted beside the gate flickered to life. Seconds later, an electric motor hummed and the gate slid open. The crew moved quickly through the opening and into the yard surrounding the warehouse. They ran in a line toward a large metal roll-up door. Another access panel was mounted beside it. Unlike the one at the gate, this panel was modern, a seamless sheet of glass. Jeff tapped the screen. It illuminated immediately. Hansel Electronic Supply. A virtual keypad appeared beneath the company greeting. Jeff glanced down at the display in his hand. "Come on, man," Thomas said. Mason looked over. Thomas was staring back toward the van. His shoulders were tense. Mason followed his gaze. The parking lot behind them appeared empty. The van sat where they'd left it. Beyond that were only the neighboring warehouses. "What are you worried about?" Mason asked. Thomas shook his head. "I don't know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I've just got a bad feeling." Mason frowned. The admission did nothing to calm his own nerves. If anything, it made them worse. The mechanical grind of the roll-up door pulled Mason from his thoughts. The door slid upward along its track, revealing a brightly lit warehouse beyond. Jeff scanned the interior. Then he stepped through the opening, his AR-15 raised at shoulder height like a soldier clearing a building. The rest of the crew followed. Tall steel shelving units stretched across the warehouse in long rows. Pallets loaded with merchandise occupied nearly every shelf. Large placards displaying row numbers hung overhead. They entered near row 15. Jeff pointed down the aisle to the right. 23 is that way. He started walking. The others fell in behind him. The warehouse was unnaturally quiet. Their footsteps echoed across the concrete floor and bounced off the steel racks. "Man, this doesn't feel right," Thomas said. Mason agreed. Something was off. The security codes Jeff had entered should have disabled the security systems and shut down any enforcement bots. They shouldn't have affected the warehouse's service machines, yet there was no sign of activity anywhere. They reached row 23. Jeff slowed and studied the shelving units. Then he checked the display on the descrambler. A moment later, he nodded. "Yeah, this is it." He looked up at the towering shelves and pointed farther down the aisle. "Definitely the right place." Then he glanced over his shoulder at Mason. "When I say, go get the van and bring it up to the roll door." Mason nodded and looked back toward the entrance. Jeff turned to Wesley. "Find one of those mobile loading platforms. If these crates are anything like the rest of the stuff in here, it'll take forever to move them by hand." Wesley had said little since they'd arrived. Now he looked uneasy. He stood frozen for a moment. Jeff was already walking again, his attention fixed on the descrambler in his hand. Thomas noticed Wesley's hesitation. He frowned. "Well, you heard the man." Wesley looked at him. "What are you waiting for?" Wesley opened his mouth as if he wanted to argue, then thought better of it. Wesley glanced down the empty aisle before reluctantly moving off. Jeff didn't seem to notice the exchange between Thomas and Wesley. His attention remained fixed on the descrambler as he continued down the aisle. Suddenly, he stopped. A pallet sat at eye level on one of the middle shelves. Jeff leaned closer and read the barcode printed on a cardboard box. Then he checked the number against the display on his device. A grin spread across his face. He looked back at the rest of the crew. "Are you guys ready to be millionaires?" "I've been ready all my life," Thomas said. The others smiled and nodded. For the first time since entering the warehouse, the tension seemed to ease. "Mason," Jeff said, "go bring the van around to the roll-up door." Mason nodded. Before turning away, he glanced at Thomas. Only 3 people in the crew knew how to drive the van: Jeff, Thomas, and Mason. Jeff and Thomas were old enough to remember owning manually driven vehicles before automation had taken over the roads. Mason wasn't. Jeff had taught him to drive as a backup. The decision had never sat well with Thomas. Jeff's obvious distrust of him had always been a sore point between the two men. Normally, Thomas would have responded with a sarcastic remark or an irritated look. This time, he barely seemed to notice. His eyes remained fixed on the pallet, on the fortune sitting in front of them. After all the planning, all the risk, and all the close calls, they were finally looking at the reason they'd come. 43,000 security certificates. Enough money to change every one of their lives. Mason left the group and jogged toward the van. He forced himself not to run. His heart was pounding. He climbed into the van, backed it up to the roll-up door, and jumped out before the engine had fully settled into idle. Then he hurried back into the warehouse. The team had already moved several crates from the pallet. Jeff and the others were waiting beside them. Mason looked around. "Where's Wesley?" Jeff exhaled heavily and wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead. "I don't know." He glanced down the surrounding aisles. "That's what I've been wondering." His expression tightened. He should have been back by now. Jeff looked toward Thomas, Veronica, and Jasmine. None of them had an answer. Finally, he turned back to Mason. "Go see if he needs help." Mason nodded and headed in the direction Wesley had gone. He passed several rows of shelving. The warehouse remained eerily silent. No service machines, no motors, nothing. Then he heard running footsteps. Mason stopped. A figure burst from an adjacent aisle. It was Wesley. His eyes were wide with terror. His face had gone pale. "Security bot!" he screamed. Mason froze. A second later, something rolled into view behind him. The machine was moving impossibly fast. Wheels. No legs. Two large drive wheels mounted beneath a steel and plastic frame, nearly 6 feet tall. The security bot shot out of the aisle and came to an abrupt stop. Its head rotated, locked on Mason, and stared. "Drop your weapon and lie face down on the ground," a human-sounding voice ordered. Mason stared at the machine. For a moment, he couldn't move. Shock and fear held him frozen in place. He recognized the model immediately. Security bots like this one were common in government buildings and the few remaining brick-and-mortar department stores. Mounted on each shoulder were two cylindrical housings with dark openings at the ends. Gun ports. Most carried 9mm machine pistols. More than enough firepower to kill a man. "Place your weapon on the floor and lie face down. You have 5 seconds to comply." Mason's mind raced. Something had gone wrong. The code Jeff had used should have shut the security systems down. It hadn't. If he complied, he would spend the rest of his life in prison. If he resisted, he would die. The bot wouldn't hesitate. He considered raising his rifle. The idea vanished almost as soon as it appeared. The machine would cut him down before he could bring the weapon to bear. And even if he fired a round before it killed him, the armor plating on the machine would stop a 5.56 round with ease. Slowly, he reached for his sling, resigned to doing what the security bot had ordered him to do. Then Wesley moved. The younger man suddenly turned and charged the bot. Mason didn't react or stop the fool. Before he could move, Wesley had already closed the distance and launched himself at the bot. For a split second, Mason thought he was trying to tackle it. The attempt was hopeless. As Wesley lunged, the bot rolled sideways. He missed completely. His body sailed past the machine and slammed chest first onto the concrete floor. His rifle skidded away across the warehouse. The bot pounced. It grabbed Wesley's right arm with one of its mechanical arms and ripped it from his body like a branch from a tree. White bone protruded from flesh, and blood spewed as the bot tossed the arm away, then crushed Wesley's skull with a sickening crunch. It was enough to send Mason into a full panic, and he rushed for the exit. The bot immediately pursued. In seconds, the scene that had just played out with Wesley was repeating itself. Only now was Mason the one running. He sprinted down the aisle and burst back into the loading area. The rest of the crew was still carrying cases from the warehouse to the van. They looked up in confusion as he raced toward them. "What? Get out!" Mason screamed. "Now!" He didn't slow down. He blew past Jasmine as she loaded a case into the back of the van. She had her back turned. She never saw the bot coming, never reacted. The machine struck her from behind. The security bot contacted its right arm, just barely below her skull. Jasmine's head fell from her shoulders as neatly as if a guillotine blade had cut it off. Jeff, Thomas, and Veronica stared at the carnage for a few seconds. Then they broke. All three turned and sprinted after Mason into the warehouse courtyard. Mason expected to feel 9mm rounds slam into his back at any moment. He wasn't running because he thought he could escape. He was running because he couldn't think of anything else to do. Someone shouted behind him, "Stop!" Mason ignored it. If the bot is going to kill him, he'd rather not see it coming. Like Jasmine. "Mason, stop!" This time he recognized the voice. Jeff. Mason slowed and turned. He expected to see the bot bearing down on them, or Jeff lying on the ground beneath it. Maybe all of them. Perhaps they had surrendered. The thought wasn't appealing, but it beat dying. Mason searched for the machine and froze. The bot stood motionless inside the warehouse. It had stopped just beyond the threshold between the roll-up door and the courtyard. Jeff, Thomas, and Veronica stood about 10 feet away. All three were unharmed. Jeff looked as confused and frightened as Mason felt. When he saw Mason had stopped running, he turned his attention back to the machine. The four of them stared at the bot. Only moments earlier, it had torn through their crew with terrifying ease. Now it stood perfectly still. No movement, No commands. No gunfire. They waited for the machine to raise one of the weapons mounted on its shoulders and open fire. It didn't. The bot neither advanced nor retreated. It simply stood at the entrance, watching. Mason's pulse hammered in his ears. The machine had already seen them. The machine recorded their faces. Their identities were probably being transmitted to law enforcement at that very moment. If an alarm had gone off, the police were already heading there. They couldn't stand here forever. Eventually, something would happen. Either the bot would kill them, or they would spend the rest of their lives in prison. "We'd better get out of here," Mason shouted to Jeff. Jeff didn't answer immediately. He kept staring at the bot. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah." Then he looked at the remaining members of the crew. "Thomas." The big man didn't respond. He never took his eyes off the warehouse entrance. His eyes were wide, full of grief. Mason suddenly remembered. Before Thomas had gotten involved with Veronica, he and Jasmine had been together. They had even talked about getting married. Now Jasmine was dead, a broken, bloody heap lying inside the warehouse. Thomas stared at the spot where she had fallen. "I ain't leaving until I kill that thing," Thomas yelled. Spittle flew from his mouth, his face contorted with rage. "You can't kill it, Thomas," Jeff shouted back. "It's just a machine, and we can't beat it. We need to go. The cops are on their way." Thomas shook his head. "No. No." He pulled back the charging handle on his rifle and let it snap forward. The metallic click seemed unnaturally loud in the silence. Then he raised the weapon to his shoulder. Jeff's eyes widened. "No!" He lunged forward and grabbed the rifle's barrel, forcing it downward. The weapon discharged. A round skipped off the concrete and ricocheted into the darkness. "It'll kill us, you idiot!" Jeff yelled as he struggled to wrench the rifle away. Thomas outweighed him by at least 50 pounds and stood nearly half a foot taller. It wasn't a contest. With a single violent jerk, Thomas tore the rifle free and swung it back toward the security bot. He fired. The bot fired. The two reports blended together. Then came a cry of pain. Thomas now lay face down on the ground in a growing pool of blood, his rifle a few feet away from him. Mason could see 3 exit points tainted by Thomas's blood on the back of his shirt. The back of his head was a jumble of exploded skull and brain matter. The now 3 remaining members of their crew stood in place, not daring to move. Several seconds passed before Mason finally found his voice. "Why isn't it attacking us?" Veronica didn't seem to hear him. Jeff shook his head. "I don't know." The bot remained motionless at the warehouse entrance. The red status lights on its torso glowed steadily, and thin wisps of smoke drifted from its gun ports. Mason wasn't interested in standing around waiting for the police. "What do we do, Jeff?" The older man looked from Mason to the bot. "I don't know what's wrong with it," he said, "but it only seems to react when somebody attacks it. It's not even giving commands anymore. I think we should get in the van and leave." "Are you stupid?" Veronica snapped. Mason and Jeff both looked at her. Jeff sneered. "No, stupid was your boyfriend trying to shoot an armored security bot." Veronica cursed in Spanish. "I'm not walking past that thing," yelled Veronica. Jeff shrugged. "Then stay here. You can explain everything to the police when they show up." Veronica's body stiffened. For a moment, Mason thought she might attack him. Instead, she remained silent. Jeff turned and walked toward the van. Mason held his breath, expecting the bot to open fire. It didn't. Jeff reached the driver's door, climbed inside, and started the engine. Nothing. The bot didn't react at all. The van rolled forward and stopped beside Mason. He climbed into the passenger seat without hesitation. If the machine was going to let them leave, he intended to take advantage of it. Jeff lowered the driver's side window. "Are you coming or not?" he called to Veronica. "Because I'm leaving either way." Veronica bit her lower lip. Then she jogged to the side door, climbed in, and slammed it shut behind her. Jeff eased the van out of the courtyard. Mason watched the bot through the passenger mirror until it disappeared from view. "What is going on?" he asked. "That thing should have torn us apart the second we got near the van." Jeff glanced into his mirror. "I don't know. Maybe it's malfunctioning. That could explain why the descrambler didn't affect it. I've never seen one act like that before." He paused. "Whatever the reason, we got lucky. We should all be dead like Thomas and Jasmine." "And Wesley," Mason said. Jeff's expression barely changed. Only a slight frown crossed his face. It killed Wesley too? Mason nodded. Silence settled over the van. Finally, Veronica spoke. I'm surrounded by amateurs, stupid gringo amateurs. Mason stared at her. I thought you cared about Thomas. Veronica shrugged. I did. He was good in bed, and he knew security systems. Mason felt his stomach turn. But he's dead now, she continued. What am I supposed to do about it? She sounded as if she were discussing a failed investment, not a man she'd supposedly loved. Mason looked away. The warehouse disaster had cost them 3 lives. Veronica didn't seem to care. For the first time, Mason seriously considered walking away from both her and Jeff. If he survived the day, he wanted nothing more to do with either of them. Chapter 4. Jeff drove the van onto 123rd South and raced west toward Redwood. The van swerved around a slow car in the right lane. One passenger hunched in the back, then shot past. Where are we going? Mason asked. West. We need to get out of the grid. Every cop in the city might be looking for us by now. One of you get the descrambler out of my bag and see if we have an alert on the network. Veronica fished it out of his bag and tapped furiously on the device. She studied the screen, then said, I don't think they have a beat on us yet. I'm not seeing any mention of the van on law enforcement banners. Law enforcement banners were the main message boards that all agencies, local and federal, used to post alerts to the public about violent fugitives. Mason was surprised that no one mentioned the recent event. Good, shouted Jeff as he floored the accelerator, pushing them at least 20 miles an hour faster than the other vehicles. It was an obstacle course to avoid hitting them. Mason noticed a small red vehicle that looked like a 20th century Volkswagen Beetle careening in front of them, then suddenly swinging rapidly to the right. He wasn't the only one who noticed. Watch out, Veronica shouted as she pointed at the careening vehicle. Is there another manually piloted car on the road? Mason asked in wonder. No one answered. They felt just as bewildered as he did. The vehicle was certainly old enough for someone to pilot it manually. The idea of an actual manually piloted car being on the road at the same time as them was akin to lightning striking twice on the same spot. They all stared at the vintage VW Beetle as they passed it, and what they saw caused all of them to shift from wonderment to utter confusion. There were 2 people in the back seat, both of them with terrified faces, with no one in the driver's seat. The VW suddenly careened into their lane, and Jeff slammed on the van's brakes to avoid a collision. Mason lost his balance and fell forward onto the dashboard with the palms of his hands. Veronica lost her grip on the descrambler, and it went flying into the windshield. Look, yelled Veronica as she pointed out the driver's side window to the traffic going eastbound. Many vehicles were acting in the same way as the Beetle. They were sporadically jerking left and right. 2 of them collided, a small red Volvo and a gray Tesla. The Volvo turned over on its side as the Tesla jolted toward the south bank of the road and began spinning out of control. What's happening? Mason asked again, this time his voice shrill. Suddenly, every car they saw on the road spun out of control. A commercial hauler with a 70-foot trailer jackknifed and swerved into their lane, slamming into 3 cars ahead of them. Jeff locked up the van's brakes, forcing the van to come to a stop. A cascade of vehicles behind them immediately hit the halted van. Every vehicle became entangled in a mass of twisted metal and crushed fiberglass. Mason lay on the floor of the van, pressed up against Veronica and trying to make sense of the many screams of fear and pain. He gazed at the young Hispanic woman next to him. Veronica's eyes were closed, and a steady stream of blood was oozing from her nose. The nose was twisted and obviously broken. Mason looked up at the driver's seat. Jeff! He yelled. Jeff slumped over the wheel and remained motionless. Mason slowly climbed to his feet and pulled Jeff back from the wheel. Blood coated his face. Mason suspected he was dead, but his eyes popped open and immediately fixed on Mason's. He yelled out, "Oh man, I think I broke my back. It hurts." Mason was too much in shock from the sudden events of the crash to answer. "Oh!" Jeff screamed again and thrashed around. Mason was fairly certain it wasn't his back that was hurting, or at least not his spine, but the crowbar that Jeff kept in the van. Somehow it had become lodged in his back during the crash. "Stop moving around," Mason yelled at him. "You're going to rupture something." You got a crowbar lodged in you? Jeff looked down at his torso. His eyes widened when he saw 3 inches of the crowbar protruding from his abdomen. "Oh my God!" he screamed. "Get it out! Get it out!" Mason ignored him and looked out the windshield. What he saw took his breath away. He saw wrecked vehicles everywhere, and something else he couldn't understand. There were dozens of downed drones, their mechanical bodies lying among the scene like dead birds. As he watched, a loud sound like a tornado filled the surrounding air. Mason searched the windshield and the side windows for the source of the noise, and then his eyes grew wide with amazement that quickly turned to terror. "No!" he screamed. "Get out now! Run!" A passenger plane, maybe a 747, Mason couldn't tell, was careening toward the surface. It was impossible to know exactly where the large plane was going to affect, but it appeared to Mason that it was going to crash directly on top of them, or extremely close. Either way, the resulting explosion would be massive. "What are you talking about?" Veronica asked him. She had become conscious while Mason was busy trying to talk to Jeff. Her own face took on an expression of horror when she spotted the oncoming aircraft. The two of them attempted to get out of the vehicle. Jeff began screaming for help. "Hey!" he yelled. "I can't move! Someone help me!" "Sorry, boss," was Veronica's sarcastic reply as she scrambled out onto the road. Mason was most of the way out when he stopped and looked back. Jeff was the epitome of pathetic as he held his hands out to Mason. "Don't leave me, man. Please help me." Mason almost left him. Jeff was a bastard, but he had given Mason a spot on his team even when Thomas had been vehement about Mason not being allowed to join. If Jeff had listened to Thomas, Mason would have been just another unskilled waste away among a sea of them. Mason owed him. Mason dove back into the van and unbuckled Jeff, ignoring the man's screams of pain as he jostled him from the driver's seat. Once he had Jeff free of the seat, Mason grabbed Jeff's shirt collar with both hands and began dragging him toward the van's exit. Jeff howled in pain as Mason pumped his legs, his face scrunched up in the effort, sweat pouring down into his squinted eyes. The sound of the jet became overpowering, and Mason was certain they were both going to die. Even if he let go of Jeff at this point and began running, he would never make it out of the zone of destruction. He stopped pulling Jeff, crouched down with his arms over his head, and screamed in terror. Chapter 4. Mason screamed until a deafening explosion drowned his voice out. An incredible heat and a blinding flash instantly filled the surrounding air. The ground seemed to shake, and Mason found it hard, even in a crouched position, not to lose his balance. When Mason opened his eyes, an orange sheen covered everything. He could hear nothing, as if he had a fishbowl over his head. Jeff's mouth was open, his chest expanding and dropping. He looked as if he were screaming. The inside of the van was like an oven, causing both men to be covered in sweat. "I'm deadin' in hell," Mason thought. Mason looked out the open sliding door. He was wrong. There was burning, lots of it, but the fire was actually several hundred feet away. Mason burst out in laughter, feeling an instant elation that he was still alive. The jet had crashed close to them. Real close, but it hadn't killed them. Mason looked back down at Jeff. "We need to get out of here." His voice sounded muted. He wondered if the explosion had damaged his eardrums. Jeff's mouth moved, but Mason still couldn't hear him. "Speak up!" Mason yelled at Jeff. "We need to get out of here. Are you able to stand up?" Jeff didn't answer and looked down at himself. He gingerly touched the crowbar protruding from his midsection. "Can you move your legs?" asked Mason. Jeff looked stupidly at Mason, appearing not to understand, but then moved both of his legs in response. "You got to get up. I can't carry you, and everything is on fire. We got to move." Jeff gave Mason another uncomprehending look. Mason felt he had done more than enough. If Jeff didn't get up now, he was going to leave him to cook in the van. "Now, Jeff, I'm leaving now." It was enough to break through the fog in Jeff's mind. Jeff struggled to his feet. Mason reached down and grabbed him under each armpit and pulled up. Jeff let out a scream that only sounded like a muffled protest to Mason's assaulted eardrums. Jeff stumbled to his feet, and Mason supported him with his left shoulder as they slowly stepped out of the van. When they reached the pavement, it felt like they were standing on a frying pan. Mason looked down and saw that it was smoking and bubbling in places. They weren't in hell, Mason thought, But the world outside the van was a close second. The grass burned, the street burned, the wrecked cars and drones burned. Flames also engulfed the buildings. What was worst of all was the burning people. The fortunate ones were dead and lying prostrate, human candles fit for a nightmare, but some were alive. They ran screaming and beating themselves. Mason guessed that burning jet fuel covered them. He knew nothing about the substance, really, just what you gained by watching shows or tidbits from the news. He knew that once it was on you and burning, there really was no putting it out. Mason searched for anything that could be a safe zone away from the fire. The area of impact where the jet crashed looked to be about a half-mile to the east. If he and Jeff could make it another few hundred feet west, they would be out of the burning zone. It probably wouldn't stay that way as the surrounding buildings and trees caught fire, but for now it was a goal to shoot for. Jeff slumped down onto his knees and groaned. Mason turned his attention to him and said, "Come on, Jeff. We've got to keep moving." Jeff shook his head no before Mason had even finished speaking. "There's no way. I need a doctor." Mason fought back the desire to strike the man in the face. "There are no doctors here, Jeff. If you don't move, you're going to burn to death. Either get up now or stay here and die." "I'm moving." Jeff looked up at him with fear and desperation. Mason had spent the last 6 months around criminals. That experience had hardened him some, but he wasn't dead in his heart. The helpless look Jeff was giving him would normally be enough to get Mason to change his mind. But to stay would mean immolation. There wasn't an option. Jeff was going to get up and move now, or Mason would let him die. Mason reached down and grabbed Jeff's right arm and pulled. "I mean it, Jeff. Now or never." There was a slight hesitation until Jeff caught a view of the burning human candles. And then he got to his feet, his face tight with pain. Mason eyed the quickest way to be free of the fire zone. He moved in that direction. Every step brought a groan of pain from Jeff, but the man kept moving, and Mason figured that was the most he could expect of him. When they reached an area that was clear of the fire, they passed within a few feet of a blonde woman in her 20s. She was wearing a blue power suit of a style that was popular among the tech elite that inhabited the nearby Silicon Slopes. She was standing next to a new Prius. The left side door was open, allowing Mason to see inside. The operation light on the dashboard was green. Like most people, Mason didn't own a vehicle of his own, but he had ridden in enough ride shares to know that a green light on the dashboard meant that the vehicle's AI was active and in control of the car. "Does your vehicle still work?" Mason asked her, thinking they could use it to escape the area. The woman didn't appear to hear him. "Hey!" he screamed at her. "Is your vehicle working?" She stirred a little this time, her gaze slowly leaving the sky and moving toward him on a neck that seemed to be made of drying cement. When she finally looked at him, Mason felt icy fingers along his spine. Her eyes were dead and devoid of life. "Gah, grr, gah," she said in a guttural groan. Mason scrunched his face in disgust as drool fell from her mouth in a steady stream. In different circumstances, Mason might have thought to check her for head trauma or some other injury that was causing her to act so strangely. He ignored her instead and sat in the Prius. Inside, he found the command screen that controlled the car's AI. Mason touched the command screen to enter a location. The thing seemed to go crazy, only displaying rapidly shifting images. For a brief millisecond, the home screen appeared. Then it shifted to the rear camera to show a scene of the burning carnage behind them. Just as fast, the image switched to the front camera, then back to the home screen. The car's computer voice was having similar issues as it uttered, "Error," over and over. Mason tapped the command screen several times, hoping it would stabilize. It didn't help. Mason cursed and exited the compact car. Jeff stood watching the scene, his eyes squinted from either pain or against the billowing smoke of burning wreckage. "I don't know what's going on, but it's dead in the water," Mason said to him. Jeff looked at the blonde woman in the blue power suit, and his eyes showed a knowing spark. "What is it?" Mason asked him. Jeff gritted his teeth as he spoke, answering, "It's like she's having the same problem as the car." Mason studied her. Her throat went up and down as if something had lodged inside it. Maybe Jeff was right. She seemed as defunct as her Prius. Mason looked around. The macabre show continued. A thin guy wearing a plaid button-up shirt and gray slacks was sitting in a brown sedan, just within the circle of burning jet fuel. Flames engulfed the brown sedan, and Mason saw yellow tongues of fire lick the inside of the back passenger window. Mason felt a growing horror as he watched one yellow tongue first touch the man's right cheek, as if tasting him to see if he was worth eating. The fire, satisfied with its sample, quickly spread up his shirt and engulfed him in flames within seconds. "Everything has gone haywire or something," Mason said. Jeff gasped and gingerly touched the area of his stomach, where the end of the crowbar protruded. He then nodded slightly. "Something like that, yeah. Or the network caused the issue, because whatever happened messed up all the vehicles." "And look at that." Jeff pointed with his right index finger at a downed passenger drone about 20 feet away from them. The thing was a mess. It had almost split down the middle when it landed on the pavement. Smoke poured from its engine compartment, with one of its forearms bent in half. Mason looked for signs of the passenger, but didn't see anyone. Fortunately, it had been empty when it crashed. Jeff gasped again and let his right arm drop to his side. "Whatever has happened has messed up anything connected to the network. It's why the van still works. Or did." He said the last two words with a tone of resentment, as if Mason somehow had done something harmful to him. "We shouldn't have left it," Jeff said while pointing at the van with a shaking finger. His voice was cracking, and Mason figured it wouldn't be long until the man was no longer conscious. "Look at it," said Jeff. Mason looked at the van. Amazingly, it was untouched by the surrounding fire. In fact, the flames had even retreated a little, providing maybe a 5-foot buffer fire-free zone around it. Mason felt both surprised and pleased. "We gotta make it back over there," said Jeff. "I'm bleeding badly. If I don't get to a doctor soon, I'm going to die. The fire destroyed everything else. The van is our only chance." Mason scanned the surrounding scene again. Jeff was probably right. Everything appeared to be malfunctioning, and a lot of it was on fire. By some miracle or blind luck, they had the only vehicle in the vicinity that wasn't affected. When Mason looked back at Jeff, he had to stifle a gasp when he saw how pale and close to death the man was. Jake gave Mason a grin that resembled the grimace of a corpse in rigor mortis. "I must look bad." Mason shook his head no. "No, I just can't believe all this," lied Mason. Jeff chuckled and rested his right hip against the Prius. "If we can't find a way to a hospital, I'm as dead as that guy," he said, as he pointed at a burning man who had collapsed face down on the pavement. Smoke billowed up from him in a sickening gray and black cloud. Even from 300 feet away, Mason could smell the odor of burning flesh. Smoke from the burning man drifted in their direction, causing both Mason and Jeff to cover their mouths and noses with their hands. It blew directly into the face of the blonde woman, the blackness of it mostly obscuring her head from Mason's view. But he could still see a slight silhouette of her features. She didn't react, even though the smell was horrendous. Perhaps Jeff was right, thought Mason. Maybe she no longer had a mind. "Jeff!" a voice screamed from behind them, and Mason turned to see the unwelcome appearance of Veronica. Sweat drenched her. Half her clothes had burned away, and soot covered what remained. "Jeff!" she yelled again as she got within a few of them. Mason couldn't believe how much gall the woman she walked up to them as if the last 10 minutes hadn't happened, as if she hadn't gleefully left Jeff to die. Jeff looked at her with a dead stare. Veronica shrank away slightly when she saw it. Her right foot slipped on something on the ground as she did so. Mason saw with revulsion that it was something that belonged to a person, something that had been inside. It was red and sticky and obviously slippery. Maybe a liver or part of one? Mason felt queasy at the thought and turned his attention away from it. Veronica licked her lips and looked apprehensively at Jeff. "I didn't think you were going to live," she said, her eyes shifting from the protruding crowbar in Jeff's face, illustrating what she meant. "I'm sorry, I wouldn't have left you if Elle had known you were going to be okay." Jeff continued giving her the death stare. "I'm not okay. I have a crowbar in my gut. I'm very not okay, but I'd be dead for sure if you had been the only one there." "What do you want, whore?" She looked away, not seeming to register the insult, or perhaps just not caring about it, and nervously wrung her hands together. "What are you going to do now?" she asked as she surveyed the chaotic scene around them. Mason might have shot her in the face if he had remembered to bring his AR. As far as he was concerned, She had abandoned both of them to die, not just Jeff. He certainly would not include her in any of their plans. As if on cue, Jeff slid down the side of the Prius and onto his right knee. He was even paler now, and his eyelids were drooping. The noise from the surrounding carnage made it difficult to hear it, but Mason could see that Jeff was having a hard time breathing, his chest rapidly expanding and contracting. He was close to passing out. As difficult as it was for Mason to accept, Veronica's presence suddenly changed to a necessary evil. Veronica had often bragged about how many connections she had in the area. It was time for her to back up her claims. She seemed to know his thoughts as she said, "I know of some safe houses close by, some places we can hide out until we can figure out what to do." Mason wasn't averse to the idea, but getting Jeff to a hospital needed to be their priority. "We need to find Jeff some medical help," Mason demanded. Veronica looked around helplessly and asked, "How?" Mason walked over to Jeff and placed both his hands under Jeff's right armpit. "Help me get him up," Mason said to Veronica. She didn't move. "Now!" Mason shouted. Veronica furrowed her brow and looked as if she were about to argue. But then she suddenly grew wide-eyed and terrified as she stared at the blonde woman who was still standing a few feet away. Mason felt his own wave of terror as he watched first the bottom of her slacks catch fire. The fire spread next to her jacket and then to her blouse. A strand of orange flames crept up the strands of her long hair, soon resulting in her entire head being engulfed in fire. Mason felt ghastly horror when he saw her make only small signs of physical distress, tiny sounds of dismay gurgling from her throat as her flesh quickly became scorched and blackened. He looked away in disgust, not being able to witness more. The ghastly scene ended Veronica's hesitation. She hastily joined Mason by cupping her hands under Jeff's left armpit, and the two of them heaved the injured man to his feet. Unlike the blonde woman or the dozens of others who were sharing in her fate, Jeff screamed in agony. He looked at both Mason and Veronica with feverish rage. "Can't you warn me before you do something like that?" Mason ignored him and gestured toward the van with his chin. "Back to the van!" he urgently yelled and walked towards it. Veronica followed his lead, and they began to half-assist, half-drag a screaming Jeff. The injured man could only walk on rubbery legs. Both Mason and Veronica let out grunts of effort as they tried to maneuver him along. "How are we going to get it out of that pileup?" Veronica asked as they neared the van. Mason had been asking himself the same question. The van was wedged between the overturned commercial hauler and about a dozen other vehicles that crashed into them when they stopped. No, he thought, not completely sandwiched. He could see a gap of maybe 5 feet on the left side of the vehicle. He thought if he could get the van started, he might use the engine of the van to push a large enough gap to squeeze it out. "Just keep moving," was all Mason said in answer. Veronica grunted, whether in exertion or annoyance Mason couldn't tell, but otherwise continued moving forward with her hands under Jeff's left armpit. In what seemed like an eternity, they finally reached their destination. Mason and Veronica helped Jeff inside, who then subsequently fell onto his uninjured left side. Mason hurriedly got into the driver's seat. The dashboard was still lit up, and the panel was solid in contrast to the Prius. Jeff is right, he thought. It has something to do with the network. The van shows no signs of being affected. Some kind of failure. Some kind of problem with programming. He started the van and then studied the surrounding scene. Behind him, the van got hopelessly stuck against a Honda and 2 Tesla vehicles. He didn't have a chance that way. Ahead of him was the jackknifed commercial vehicle. His only genuine option was a sharp left and straight through the flames. Other than the obvious danger of catching fire, one thing that really worried Mason was the older-style lithium batteries equipped on the van exploding due to them being subjected to an open flame. A noise broke out in the pileup behind him, and he felt dismayed when the vehicles only feet away caught fire. Inhabitants in 2 vehicles, a Tesla and a Chevy, were still in their seats, buckled in from what he could tell. An overweight man in the Tesla had his eyes open and staring ahead, not moving. His mouth open in a rigor mortis guffaw became a statue of flames as the expanding inferno engulfed his vehicle. Mason decided he had had enough of the horror show around them. He jerked the steering wheel hard to the left and punched the accelerator. The acceleration of the electric motor was almost immediate. and Mason barely stayed in the seat as the van shot forward to the left. The van's front grazed the front bumper of the commercial vehicle and nearly sideswiped the Chevy as it rocketed out of the pileup. The road was an obstacle course of stalled and crashed vehicles. Mason alternated between slamming on the accelerator and the brake as he desperately tried to get clear of the fire. When they finally put the wreckage of the airliner behind them, he slowed and stopped. He looked over his shoulder and saw Veronica sitting on the floor of the van next to a now unconscious Jeff. "Where is this place you mentioned?" he asked her. She looked silently at Mason until Mason wondered if she had lied about being able to get Jeff help so he would bring her along. She then hesitantly said, "You need to head west more. It's clear out past Harriman, but you can head south until you get to 140. Then head west." Mason looked hard for any sign of deception. She stared back. Her eyes were two stones of obsidian. He thought she looked sincere, but she was a lifetime liar. Lacking the skills for certainty, he followed her directions. He went along for the time being, hoping she wasn't lying, since he had just endured a traumatic experience with a weaponized auto-security unit and witnessed a scenario resembling a micro-apocalypse. He put the van into drive and continued west toward Redwood Road. Chapter 5. Redwood turned out to be as chaotic and accident-strewn as 123rd. Several times it was necessary for them to drive onto the adjoining sidewalks. It wasn't just a local issue, thought Mason. It's bigger than that, way bigger. He looked out the windshield at the sky. There wasn't a single blinking light, no sign of drones or aircraft. "Veronica," he said, while briefly glancing back at her over his right shoulder. "Yeah," she answered, her voice sounding distracted. "Me too. I guess I can't hold that against her," he thought. "What does it show on the Descrambler?" "Huh? The Descrambler. Look at it and see if it's online. Check the law enforcement banners again." She didn't respond as she searched in Jeff's pack to retrieve it. "What's the problem now?" Jeff asked. He was getting worse. He was lying on his side, blood pooling on the van's floor, even paler. Jeff's eyes were replete with pain. "Just checking to see if the network is truly out," Mason responded. "It's still showing the same thing," Veronica said. "What do you mean?" Mason asked. "Like I said," Veronica answered, annoyed. "Same thing as before." "Come up here and show me." Veronica said something rude in Spanish, but she did as Mason requested. She sat down in the passenger seat and held the tablet so he could see it. Mason glanced over several times while simultaneously navigating the road before him. She was right. It didn't look like it had changed since they first left the warehouse. It must be the entire network, Mason thought. That meant the system had shut down everything. Shutting down wasn't really the right thing, though. More like, it's gone crazy or something. How large, he asked himself. Salt Lake? Utah? The entire country? As he drove, he tried to think about how much of the world could even be affected. If it truly was a network issue, he supposed it could be the entire world, at least the more developed part. Europe, Asia, most of Latin America, the Middle East. And where's the emergency response? It had been at least an hour since the airliner crash, and he was yet to see a sign of law enforcement or fire control. There were hundreds of people on the street, most of them from stalled vehicles, but probably from surrounding businesses too. Everyone they had encountered so far seemed to be in a daze. They stared blankly at the passing van as an animal might when terrified by a gunshot. Others sat on the roadway, their heads down in their hands, purpose trying to register the chaos around them. He didn't think that would last long. Soon they would recognize how messed up everything was. Until this moment, they had hardly noticed the van and its unique status as a working vehicle. When they snapped out of their shock, Mason figured that would quickly change. "What do we have as far as weapons?" Mason asked over his shoulder. "What?" was Veronica's response. "You heard me," Mason said impatiently. "What do we have? Can you see my AR? It should be back there." There was a shuffling in the back as they neared what looked like an enormous pileup that stretched across all 4 lanes of Redwood. A large crowd of people were gathered around the wreckage. Mason slowed the van to a crawl when they came within several hundred feet of the crash. From what he could see, the pileup comprised a mixture of passenger vehicles and several passenger drones that had fallen from the sky. There was carnage in each of the downed drones. Unlike the one he had seen an hour earlier, these drones had been carrying passengers. They crept on until they were only a dozen feet from the crowd. Mason stopped the van and put the transmission into park. The masses gathered around the pileup differed from the survivors Mason had seen at the airliner crash. Most of them appeared to be cognizant and uninjured. "Do you think we can get through?" Veronica asked. Mason felt a small measure of relief when he saw her holding an AR rifle. "Is that mine?" Mason asked, indicating the AR she was holding. "Yeah," she answered, not taking her eyes off the crowd. "How are we going to get around this?" Mason turned his attention back to the crowd ahead. Mason shook his head, not knowing. Jeff groaned in the back and said in a muted voice, "You guys better get me somewhere quick. I don't have long. I can feel it." Mason looked at Jeff and saw he was right. The man was now ghost white. He had a clammy appearance and his eyes were unfocused. "Hold on, man, we're working on it." Frustrated, Mason checked the van's GPS system, offline, like everything else. "We're going to have to backtrack to a residential area," Mason said to Veronica. "My guess is all major travelways are going to look like this." It was amazing how fast things could tip. Barely an hour ago, they were desperate fugitives. Now they were the only ones still functioning in a ruined world. The biggest problem Mason had now was trying to figure out which way was south or west. He had lived his entire life with GPS and guided help to get around. Without it, he felt as blind and lost as if he were in a pitch-black room. He had always known he lived in a valley surrounded by mountains, but they all looked the same. Trying to use them as landmarks wasn't a possibility. He looked at Veronica and in a panicked tone asked her, "Where are we? Which way is west?" She tore her eyes away from the chaotic scene on the street. Mason felt disheartened. Veronica's face showed an equal level of confusion. "I'm not sure," she said as she looked around. Mason wanted to scream at her, but bit his tongue, knowing that it would only panic her more. Mason put the van in reverse and began backing up. Veronica, still holding the AR, sat in the passenger seat. The barrel of the rifle bumped against Mason's right thigh as she settled into the seat. "Put that on the floor before you shoot me in the stomach," Mason ordered. She gave him a quick, resentful look, but she did as she was told. As they backed up, several people from the crowd noticed them for the first time. A few pointed and said something to the rest of the crowd. This drew the attention of several others. One of them, a dark-haired man wearing a blue t-shirt with white sleeves and a small decal on the left breast, broke into a run. Three others, two men and a woman, soon followed him. All of them were younger, probably in their 20s, except for the woman who looked to be middle-aged. "You better hurry," Veronica said. "They don't look friendly." Mason agreed with a grunt as he pressed the accelerator to the floor. The man in the blue shirt and white sleeves was by far the most athletic. He pulled ahead a good 20 feet ahead of the other three, reached the van, and jumped onto the driver's side running board. "You've got to help me," he yelled, leaving a small spray of spittle on the closed window. His eyes were manic and wide. "Please," he yelled, and then the door opened as he pulled on the outside lever. Mason kept his right foot on the accelerator as he blindly hoped he wouldn't back into anything stalled on the road behind. The man continued to hold on to the door as it swung out on its hinges. The scene might have continued until Mason ran the van into a stalled vehicle or meandered off into the side of a building if Veronica hadn't gotten up, reached across Mason, and grabbed the open door by its handle. She yanked it closed by using her weight as leverage. The door swung back, the man still clinging onto it like a drowning person holding onto a life preserver. The man's right leg was on the inside, keeping it from locking shut. Meanwhile, the other three that had followed him were still running, the two men keeping a steady pace, the woman falling behind and visibly tiring. "Let go, you idiot!" Mason screamed at the blue-shirted man. "Please," was all he said in response. Mason growled and began swerving back and forth to get him to let go. "Hold on," Veronica yelled at Mason. "Stop and let him in." "What?" was all Mason could say in response. "Just do it," she yelled. Mason, desperately wanting him off and not having time to think about it, complied. Veronica produced a Glock pistol in her right hand. He wasn't sure if the pistol was to be used on him or the guy at the door, but he thought it would be both of them if he didn't do as she commanded. As soon as Mason got the van stopped, the man clinging to the door let go and dropped to the ground on both feet. Cat-like, he recovered in a split second and hopped into the van, literally crawling over Mason. The other two men were now less than 5 feet away. Mason didn't waste any time as he jammed the vehicle into drive and floored the accelerator. The van shot forward and missed both men by inches as they jumped out of the way. The woman who had been running with them had given up and was sitting in the middle of the road several hundred feet away, panting to catch her breath or sobbing with disappointment, maybe both. Mason turned the van around, still having the accelerator pressed to the floor, and drove back in the direction they had come. The tires screeched and smoked, and the air filled with the smell of burning rubber, leaving a blue cloud behind them. "Thank you," said the blue-shirted man. Mason frowned as his only response. He did not know whether they were traveling north or south. "Man, we could be going east for all I know." He screamed in his mind. He didn't think so, though. They had done enough traveling in the van in the past 6 months for him to know that the direction they had been going in was toward Utah County, and he felt confident that it was south of Draper. But east and west? Which way was that? "You don't move, or I'll shoot you," Veronica said to the man in the blue shirt. He stared at her, his eyes still wide and manic, but now with a tinge of fear. Is that a gun?" he asked. "What do you think, dummy?" The man nodded and swallowed. After his eyes darted around the van's interior, they focused on Jeff, who was unconscious. His eyes grew even wider as he saw the blood and the protruding crowbar. His fear visibly increased. "Okay, whatever. Thank you for picking me up." His eyes became fixed on the gun in Veronica's hand, scared enough to satisfy Veronica. She sat down in the passenger seat, the gun still pointed toward the man who was now sitting on the floor between the driver and passenger seats. "Stop for a second," she said to Mason. Mason wanted to protest, but after checking and not seeing any sign of the two men who had been running after them or anyone else on the street, he decided he wouldn't argue. He stopped and put the van in park. He didn't look at her as she talked, but kept his eyes on the rearview mirror for the two men who might still be in pursuit. "Are you from around here?" Veronica asked the blue-shirted man. He nodded. "Where?" He looked confused and stuttered as he spoke. "What do you mean, like my address?" "No, stupid. I mean, what town? Are you from Draper or what?" "Oh," he said, swallowing again and running his left hand through his hair. "No, South Jordan." Veronica frowned and looked at Mason. "Is that close to here?" she asked. Mason wasn't completely sure, but he thought so. He raised his hands in a "who knows" gesture. Veronica turned her attention to the newcomer. She raised her eyebrows, directing the question to him. "It's just a few miles away," said the blue-shirted man. Veronica looked at him suspiciously. "You better not be lying." "Why would I?" "Maybe because I got a gun on you, and you know I'll kill you if you make me unhappy." The man gave a nervous laugh. "I'm not lying. It's real close." Veronica gestured toward Jeff with her chin. "We need to get him to a hospital. Can you guide us to one? With no GPS or nothing? Can you tell us how to get to one?" Until this point, Mason couldn't figure out what Veronica was up to. When he realized, he suddenly understood why she had been so successful in gaining Jeff's trust. She was smart on her feet, especially in a crisis. The man looked at Jeff again, his fear still palpable, but calmed a little when he realized they wanted him to help them. He nodded. "Yeah," he said. "There's an IHC emergency outlet just a few miles from here. I can see it from my house." Veronica didn't look conceived. "Okay, but can you find it now? Look around you. Everything has gone to hell. Can you find it in this mess?" This made the man pause for a second, seemingly not completely certain. Sitting up, he looked out the window. He scanned the surrounding streets and buildings. He then nodded. "Yeah, I grew up here. I used to walk to school. It's been some years, but I can still find my way." Veronica looked at Mason and Mason shrugged. What choice did they really have? "What's your name?" Veronica asked the blue-shirted man. "Mike Sherman," he answered. "All right, Mike," Veronica said. "How about you sit where I am and tell my partner how to get to this hospital you mentioned?" Mike nodded, and Veronica moved out of the seat. As she did so, she reached down and picked up the AR that she had placed on the floorboard earlier. Mike's fear and surprise increased again when he realized what it was, but he said nothing. Mike sat in the vacated seat, and Veronica stood behind it. She placed the AR on the floor in the van's rear, and then put her left hand on the top of the back headrest of the passenger seat. She looked at Mason and said, "Let's get out of here." "Wait," said Mike. He looked scared but resolved as Veronica gave him a death stare. Mike held up his hands to show he wasn't trying to be combative. "Look, there's a reason I ran after you. This van." He stopped and looked at Mason and Veronica as if to gauge how his words were being accepted. "This van," Veronica repeated sarcastically. "What about it?" "It's like you just said. Everything is chaotic. Nothing is working. My phone, my friend's car that I had been in. He was one of the other guys who ran after you." "Bah!" Veronica shouted in disgust. "Who cares, gringo? What about the van?" "Okay, okay," Mike said, giving the Glock a nervous look. "I need you guys to take me somewhere after I get your friend to a hospital." Veronica took in frustrated breath, clearly not happy with what she was hearing. "After," Mike said hurriedly. "After we get your friend help." Veronica let out a hiss between clenched teeth. "What is it you need?" Mason asked. "It's my parents. They live in Layton. I need to get up there to see if they're okay." "Not gonna happen," Veronica immediately said. Mike frowned, and his resolve turned stubborn. "Then it's a no-go on my end. I gotta see them. It's agreed, or I don't help you." Mason knew Veronica well enough that making a demand on her when she held all the cards was a sure way to get yourself killed, so he interjected before she lost it. "All right then, this will be the deal. Can you drive this?" Mike looked disappointed. "I've never driven a vehicle in my life." Mason expected this, but he still believed it was worth a shot. He desperately wanted to get home to his own family, but he was going to have to make a detour before that happened. "Fine. You get us to the hospital and her," said Mason, gesturing to Veronica with his chin, "where she needs to go, and I'll take you to your parents' house." Mike looked at Veronica, no doubt gauging how she felt about it. Mason could tell by her body language that she wasn't thrilled. "That works. I just need you to get me there at some point," said Mike a little apprehensively, likely picking up on Veronica's disapproval. Mason stole a look at Veronica, and she said, "Fine," without taking her eyes off Mike. Mason didn't think she was one bit fine with it, but he had to settle for it. "Where do I go, Mike?" Mason asked as he put the van into drive and began forward. Mike directed them for the next 20 minutes as they meandered between dead vehicles and people alike. There were several times he had to outrun individuals and small packs of people attracted to the one and only working vehicle. As they drove, he kept feeling tension coming from Veronica, who never let the barrel of the Glock be completely off from pointing at Mike's back. Mason noticed the irony of Veronica switching from pariah to the apparent new head of their now vastly shrunken crew. It wasn't a dynamic he would suffer to be permanent, but he would go along with it for now. She, after all, seemed to be the only one with any ideas. When Jeff was safe and taken care of, Mason would rethink his position. Chapter 5. "Okay, keep going on this road until you get to Henderson Drive," said Mike. "It's probably 3 more blocks, then go right." He drove until he saw the sign for Henderson Drive, then turned right as Mike had directed. "Keep on this one for the next 2 miles. That will put us on 64th Street South. Then turn left. That'll run all the way to the hospital." They continued on Henderson until it turned into 64th Street. Amazingly, there was relatively little wreckage or stalls. It was impossible to know why, but it was a stroke of good luck that Mahan felt grateful for. Mason gave a quick glance back at Jeff. He was completely unconscious, his chest rapidly going up and down with rapid breathing. Blood had soaked the front of his shirt and his pants. More had seeped onto the van floor. There wasn't any way of knowing for sure how much time he had, but it certainly would not be long. Mason floored the accelerator, and the van quickly reached 80 miles per hour. A rectangular multi-story building soon appeared on the right a few miles ahead. "That's it," Mike said. "Good. I'm going to pull in front of the building, and all 3 of us will pick him up and take him in." Neither Veronica nor Mike responded to what he said, but Mason could tell Veronica didn't like it. "You're not gonna do it?" Mason asked her. Veronica had been staring ahead, her face tight and her eyes hard. She didn't shift her gaze or her expression as she answered, "I didn't say I wouldn't." Mason wasn't sure how she would be when they entered the hospital with a bloody dying Jeff. The attendants in the ER would almost certainly be suspicious and full of questions. Mason knew Veronica was capable of anything. The last thing they needed was for her to get aggressive as they tried to get Jeff help. I'm not planning on staying, Mason said to her. I'm going to put him on the floor and tell them he needs help and leave. If you're nervous about wasting time, you don't need to be. Veronica slowly turned her attention away from the road ahead and looked at Mason. She gave Mason a long, cool, appraising look. She must have accepted what she heard because she finally nodded and looked ahead, the apprehension seeming to be gone. Mason surmised she couldn't care less if Jeff lived or died. Mason felt a sense of guilt about just dumping Jeff off like he was a burden to be rid of. I have to get home, he reminded himself. He could only imagine the anxiety Lorelei was feeling right now. Mason followed the red ER signs to a set of double doors. He stopped the van and stood while placing the van into park. He looked at Mike and said, "Help me get him inside." Mike stood and followed Mason into the back of the van. Mason grabbed the unconscious Jeff under each armpit. "You grab his legs," he said to Mike. Mike took hold of each of Jeff's legs by the calf area, and both men raised Jeff simultaneously. "Get the door," Mason said to Veronica, who had been watching them. Veronica opened the sliding door and stepped aside to give them room. Mason stepped out first, walking backwards. Then Mike followed them. Veronica stepped out last and shut the door. The hospital seemed eerily silent to Mason. He had expected to see the place bustling with new patients, considering the many accidents that had happened in the last hour. But he quickly corrected himself when he realized that all of those injured and dying people had no way to get here except on foot. "Veronica, stay with the van." The young Hispanic woman looked at him suspiciously. "We can't risk someone driving off in it. Mike and I got this. You need to guard it." Her eyes narrowed a little, but she complied and returned to the vehicle. Mike looked expectantly at Mason as he strained with the effort of holding Jeff's lower body. "This is getting heavy," he said. Mason didn't respond, but to Mike's visible relief, he began walking backward again toward the hospital's automatic sliding doors. There was an information desk inside. "Hey!" Mason screamed out as the two men shuffled their load into the building. When they reached the desk, Mason placed Jeff's torso on the floor, and Mike quickly followed suit with Jeff's legs. "Hello!" yelled Mason. The desk was located inside a small, enclosed area. It looked like a room that was maybe 7 feet long and 4 feet wide. Directly to the left of the enclosure was another pair of sliding doors. The doors separating the emergency room from the outside world were open, but someone had shut them. Mason tried to pry them open with his hands. They didn't budge, as if someone had welded them shut. There were small rectangular windows on each of the two doors, and Mason peered through one, hoping to see someone on the other side. He could see a hallway and another desk, this one long and cluttered with various electronic devices that Mason couldn't identify. No people. There were several service bots sitting idly by the desk. Mason banged his fist on the door. None of the bots moved or gave any kind of sign that they registered his presence. Mason let out a frustrated sigh and walked back over to where Mike stood. He looked down at the unconscious Jeff. An image of a clock entered his thoughts. One of the old analog styles that his mother had on the wall of the living room of their apartment where he had grown up. The clock had always fascinated him because it represented a world long gone. He had spent hours over the years watching the red second hand count out the minute, then the hour, and finally the day. Mason pictured that clock in his mind now, with the second hand counting out the minutes, maybe 5, that they had spent here. Those were 5 minutes that Lorelei and his daughter spent alone in what was now a world of chaos. "Sorry," Mason said to Jeff's unconscious form, and then he made a beeline for the open sliding doors of the emergency room. "What?" he heard Mike say behind him before the man realized that Mason intended to leave Jeff where he was. That was the most Mike gave in protest. He followed Mason out of the building and into the waiting van. In less than a minute, they were out of the parking lot heading west on 64th South. "So that's it? Follow 64th until it ends?" said Veronica. The man nodded, and Mason turned his attention away from the street long enough to give her a quick glance, wondering what she was getting at. When Mason and Mike got into the van after leaving Jeff in the emergency room, Mason immediately pressed Mike for details on the quickest route to Layton. "Just turn left and head west until it meets up with Highway 85. It's easy. 64th dead ends into it." Veronica had seemed hyped up as soon as Mason and Mike had returned. She still held the Glock in her right hand, the barrel of it pointing haphazardly in Mike's direction. Mike either didn't seem to notice or he ignored it as they drove toward Bangerter. "You're positive?" Veronica asked him. "How do you know it does?" Mike nodded vigorously and said, "My dad drove for Uber before everything became automated. He used to take my brother and me on trips in the family car, showing us different sights around the city. It's been a while since I've been out that way, but 64th literally ended at the Magna City limits. I'm sure they developed the area more since then, but it will still take you there." Mason glanced again at Veronica, and later he would think about how he should have foreseen what happened next. As soon as Mike had stopped speaking, Veronica pistol whipped him on the back of the head. "Ah!" Mike shouted and fell face first onto the floor of the van, in between the driver and passenger seats. "What are you doing?" Mason yelled out, and then yelled, "No!" as Veronica pointed the muzzle of the handgun at the prone man and pulled the trigger. The sound was deafening. Mason slammed on the brakes, sending Veronica crashing forward into the windshield. All was confusion for the next few seconds, as the ringing in Mason's ears drowned out Veronica's screaming as she quickly got to her feet and pointed the gun at Mason. "Bastardo!" she screamed. Mason barely heard it. "Tu pedazo de mierda!" she screamed. "I'll kill you if you don't get moving right now." Mason stared at her with equal parts rage and fear. "Why did you do that?" he yelled at her. She balanced herself and pistol-whipped Mason across his face. Stars shot out over his field of vision, and his nose immediately erupted into a stream of blood. "Because I will not go to jail for that, estupido," she screamed. "I'm not going for nothing. I'd kill you too if I knew how to drive this van. Keep driving." Mason dropped the van into drive and began speeding up because he knew she wouldn't hesitate to follow through on her threat. Veronica almost lost her footing as the van picked up speed and quickly sat down in the passenger seat with the pistol still trained on him. "How about you point that at something before you accidentally kill me?" he said. She smiled and said, "It won't be an accident if it happens." Mason stole a glance at her. She was enjoying herself. Her dark eyes were obsidian glints of pleasure. "I never liked you and still can't see why Jeff let you on. I thought you were too soft, and I was right. You were actually going to take that Pendaho where he wanted." She shook her head with disgust. Mason glanced down at the now dead man and grimaced when he saw how much brain matter and blood had resulted from the gunshot. He looked forward again, unable to continue looking at the grisly scene on the floor. "Oh, take a good look," she said, smiling. "That's you if you even flinch again without my say-so." Mason didn't answer or look at her as he kept his eyes forward. Out of his peripheral vision, he saw her scoot towards him, and he felt her breath on his cheek. It smelled rank with undigested food and stomach acids. "I actually hope you do, Mason. I'm not kidding about hating you. All that back at the warehouse has you written all over it." "What?" Mason said, confused despite his fear. "What the hell are you talking about?" "That was a setup," she said venomously. "What was?" asked a confused Mason. "There's never been autos in that place, especially weaponized ones," replied Veronica. "That was you." Mason stole a glance and her eyes widened with rage, causing him to look ahead again quickly. "Look, I don't know what you're talking about," said Mason. "I've never been there and had never heard of the place until Jeff told us about it. How could I have possibly set you up? And why would I have anyway? That bot was going to kill me too." "Did it?" Mason visualized the final moments of the failed heist. "I don't remember you being shot at," she continued. She was right about that, but none of them had. "I only remember Thomas being shot and Jasmine being torn apart. I'll bet that was satisfying to see, wasn't it? I'll bet you were cheering inside." Mason glanced at her and saw she still had the same grin on her face as she spoke. "Look, if you're trying to gear yourself up to kill me, I don't see what you're waiting for. We can't be far from where you want to go. You might as well just do it." He found himself surprisingly calm while he was talking. He hadn't had a lot of experience with firearms before he joined Jeff's crew. In the past 3 months, he had seen plenty of violence and death, but it was still a relatively new thing to him. Veronica was insane. Mason was sure of that now. That made her totally unreasonable. She was going to kill him, but he knew she would at least wait until she didn't need him to drive anymore. He had to come up with something before then. Something to at least distract her long enough to either get the weapon away from her or enable him to escape. His mind seemed locked. He could only think about the gun pointed at him and the sound the bullet made when Mike shot him in the back of the head like a dog. He hated her even more now. Mike was just some schmuck. Well, like Mason. He had been out and about at the wrong time and caught miles from where he wanted to be. He had even helped them. There was no reason to think that he would have betrayed them to law enforcement. And even if he had wanted to, how could he have done so anyway? Mason had still not seen any sign of law enforcement or any other government official. All communication was down. Veronica had killed Mike because he had foolishly told them how to get to Magna. Mike at that point was no longer needed. Once Mason got her as far as he could, he would join Mike's fate. That made him think of Lorelei and Catherine. If he were dead, they would have nobody. He would not bother with begging. It was fight or flight with a psychopath like Veronica. 64th South eventually ended in a T intersection like Mike had said. Mason came to a stop. Veronica looked up both streets to the left and right and began chewing on her bottom lip. "Which way?" Mason asked. "Shut up," Veronica said. Mason let out a sigh and sat back in the driver's seat. Around them was what was now becoming a common sight. Stalled vehicles filled the street, and many small drones had fallen from the sky. Packages that many of the drones had been carrying also spilled onto the roadway. To his amazement, he saw one that had a gold and turquoise emblem on the side. He recognized it as the insignia of the Krinchek Corporation, the #1 manufacturer of implants and augmentation devices. Mason guessed that augmentation devices were now about as useful as tits on a bull, as his mother used to say whenever she spoke of his deadbeat dad. Its presence would suit other purposes, however. Veronica shook her head in disgust and said, "Go right." When Mason didn't do as instructed, she looked down at him, more of her obsidian lunatic lamps. She noticed the look on his face and scrunched her own up in confusion. "What's your problem?" Mason pointed at the parcel on the ground. "Do you have any idea what that might be worth?" he asked. She looked at it and smirked. "Right now it's worth nothing. Haven't you noticed that the entire system has just gone to hell? Now quit screwing around and go right like I said." "How do you know that?" Mason argued. "You've got X-ray vision or something?" "Look closer. That's a Krinchek product. I got a friend who bought their lowest level sight augmentation enhancement, and it cost $8,000 uninstalled. That was a used one too. Whatever is in that package is new. Maybe the top line too." Veronica had listened to his montage without comment. Mason had guessed right that she hadn't expected him to do anything other than obey her while pissing his pants in fear. He in truth agreed with her. Whatever was in the parcel had been, just a few hours ago, was worth likely tens of thousands of dollars and easily sold on the black market. But it was now no more valuable than the recycled cardboard that encased it. But his argument had done what he wanted. It had been offline from what she had expected, and she was momentarily confused. The gun deviated several inches towards the rear of the van. Mason thought it was his best and last chance to save his life. He put his right arm straight out and then down in a kind of chopping motion, thinking the most important thing to do was to keep the muzzle pointing away from him. Veronica had been so fixated on what he had been saying that she hadn't expected his move. Her arm holding the gun went straight down and toward the floor before she could react. When the Glock was pointing at the floor, she pulled the trigger. Once again, the inside of the van filled with the explosion of a 9mm round. Mason's world suddenly rang with his damaged ears. He hardly noticed, though, as he grabbed her right wrist and leaned down to put all of his body weight on her arm in order to keep the Glock pointed at the van floor. He then reared back his head and snapped it forward, head-butting her in the face. Veronica let out a squeal of pain and shock as blood gushed from her mouth and nose. She spat out her front 2 upper teeth, along with a mouthful of blood. Mason reared back again and centered his forehead directly on her nose. If his ears hadn't been ringing from the gunfire, he would have heard an audible snap as the cartilage in her nose collapsed. Veronica pulled the trigger on the handgun again. This time, the trajectory of the bullet was only inches from Mason's left foot as the woman fought frantically to get control of the weapon. Mason knew if she did, he was dead. Her eyes had a rabid, animalistic glee that resembled hot coals. her tan Hispanic features scrunched in a rage. The whole of her body was like a wound spring in a mad machine. This machine would wreak destruction on everything in its reach if someone allowed it to be set free. Mason kicked her left knee with the insole of his right foot, leaning forward and down to give the strike more leverage. The knee buckled, sickening inward as tendons, muscle, and bone gave way to the force. The rage in Veronica's eyes now turned to shock and surprise as she tumbled to the van floor. As she did so, Mason ripped upwards on the Glock, forcing it free. He quickly brought the barrel to bear on Veronica. She had enough time to scream, "No!" before Mason pulled the trigger 5 times in quick succession. 3 rounds entered her torso, 2 in her chest and 1 in her abdomen. The final 2 destroyed her face and instantly extinguished the chaotic life of Veronica. Mason stood looking at the wrecked corpse and panted from the exertion of the fight. He kept the weapon pointed at her and didn't move for the next 10 seconds, not totally sure a person who was so full of venom and mayhem could have died so easily. But that's the absurdity of existence. Any person has tremendous power and ability to both build and destroy, but they are so weak too, so easily blown out. The light that was in Veronica's eyes, spirit, consciousness, whatever it was now gone. "Yeah," Mason croaked in a low voice, as in response to her last dying word. Mason found he didn't care. It wasn't just the callousness he had developed in the past few years, being exposed to violence and death. This was a sense of her getting what she had coming to her. After a few more minutes, he got up and opened the van's sliding side door. He grabbed the dead woman by both arms and drug her out onto the pavement. He then climbed back into the van and looked down at her. "Pendo," he said, then spat on her corpse before closing the door. Mason spent the next 4 hours trying to find his way to Saratoga Springs. He was aware it was south, and he understood that reaching the point of the mountain would allow him to get home. His confidence stemmed from living there long enough to recognize enough landmarks to locate his neighborhood. He hadn't factored in the darkness of night, though. The landscape was pitch black without any electricity, just as it must have been centuries ago. If it hadn't been for the van's headlights, he likely would have had to stop somewhere for the night and try in the morning. It was almost by pure luck that he eventually found Highway 85. That was a familiar road, and by centering on landmarks like businesses that he had frequented over the years, he could determine which direction was south. Once he got to Harriman, he was in territory that he knew well, and it became comparatively smooth sailing. The sight of his house almost brought tears to his eyes. He pulled into the driveway and practically jumped out of the van before it came to a full stop. He ran to the front door and tried to rip it open. The door was locked. He ran his palm over the security panel above the doorknob out of pure habit. The door remained locked. No electricity, no network. "Lorelei!" he screamed and beat his right fist on the door. "Lorelei!" he screamed again when there was no answer. He tried to keep panic out of his voice. What if they're not here? What if she left in a rage after he went with Jeff to go to her parents' house? How would he ever be able to know with things as they are? The thought of it dispelled any notion of controlled panic. It was on full exhibition as he began to beat frantically on the door and scream her name. He looked the same window that Lorelei had and watched him leave with Jeff hours earlier. The house was pitch black inside. The results were the same when he moved to other windows on the front of the house. He was about to go back to the van and try to find his way to her parents' house in Springville. Springville? How was he ever going to make it there? He hadn't been there in 5 years. Her parents were ardent Mormons and had never approved of their marriage. They, in fact, hated him. He had only been there twice. He didn't have a clue how to find their home, but he had to try. He had to find them. He got as far as halfway to the van when the front door suddenly opened and a terrified-looking Lorelei stuck her head out. "Mason?" she asked, sounding uncertain that it was him. "Thank God!" he yelled as he ran to the open door. She stepped back as he rushed in and grabbed her in an embrace. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice both scared and bewildered. "I don't know. I don't know what's happened. I thought you had left. Left with Catherine. I was going to go to your parents' house." "My parents?" she asked, further confused. Mason ignored her and asked, "Where's Catherine?" "Downstairs. I went down with Catherine when I heard people outside trying to get in. It was after the power went out. I sat here for hours waiting for it to come on, but it still hasn't. Eventually, I fell asleep on the couch until I heard a noise at the front door. I thought it was you until I heard them talking. She stopped speaking and looked up at him, making eye contact. Her eyes spoke of confusion and deep fear. It was so strange, Mason. They weren't making any sense. They kept shouting and beating on the door. Then they would stop and start crying. It sounded like crazy people. That's why I didn't answer when you first started beating on the door. I thought it was them coming back. Mason felt a sudden rush of love for her. He was positive he had lost her, and here she was in front of him, ingloriously not hurt. "What's going on, Mason?" she asked. "What's happened? Why is everything still shut off? Who were those people?" Her eyes became watery and Mason knew she was close to tears. It was so strange. The people trying to get in were so strange. They screamed and beat at the door when they couldn't open it. She cried and then buried her face in his chest. He hugged her, and when the sound of Catherine crying downstairs drifted up to them, he laughed a little in the joy of hearing her voice. "I don't know," he said. "Something happened with the network. Everything, including the grid. The shutdown has affected everything. The people trying to get in? Probably just scared neighbors. Go downstairs and get the baby. Grab everything she would need. I mean everything." "Okay," answered Lorelei, concern in her voice. "Why? What are we going to do?" The fear that he had held a few minutes ago about going there was now looking like a good idea. "We're going to your parents' house." "What? Serious?" Mason couldn't blame her for asking that. She of all people knew how much he disliked them. "Yes," said Mason, "right now. We've got to get out of here. Your parents have all that food, storage, and supplies. We got nothing but a few weeks' worth of groceries. Get all of it, especially the baby stuff, and load it into the van." She stood looking at him, still not sure if he was serious. "Now, go!" he yelled at her, and then he walked back outside. Mason trotted to the van and climbed in. He located the AR. After checking the rifle's chamber for ammunition, he climbed out of the van. He studied the houses next door and across the street. Right now, the neighborhood looked empty and peaceful. Whatever had happened earlier with Lorelei and the neighbors seemed to be over for the moment. Yes, for the moment, he thought. Mason didn't believe it would stay that way. If this situation were permanent, or even just something that would last a few weeks, things would be anything but peaceful. First, the water would run out. He hadn't checked the faucets, but it wouldn't surprise him if the water pressure was gone. Even if it wasn't, the water treatment plants were all automated. "How long until you were drinking sewage?" Lorelei exited the house and hurried to the van. Catherine was being carried by her in her car seat. She noticed the rifle in Mason's hands. She stopped and looked scared. "What's wrong?" she asked him. Mason shook his head dismissively. "Nothing. Just being careful." Mason opened the sliding door and placed the rifle on the floor as Lorelei buckled Catherine into the passenger seat. "Mason, what are we doing?" she asked while getting the last strap into place. Mason looked at her, not feeling completely sure himself. "I don't want to stay here if things stay this way. We need to get out of here before the real panic sets in." She scrunched her brow, not sure of what he meant. "You think it's going to stay this way? You mean the power being out? Everything shut down?" Mason shrugged. "Even if it's just for a bit, I think things could get crazy. Your dad has always been warning about something like this. Things falling apart. They have supplies, food storage, and they will protect us." What he didn't say is that they would protect their daughter and granddaughter, not necessarily him, but that was good enough. "And we need to go now before everyone figures out that the food is going to disappear along with the grocery stores. We need to beat the chaos." "And what if it doesn't?" she countered. "What if the lights come back on tomorrow?" Mason shrugged again. "Good," he said matter-of-factly. "Then Catherine gets to see her grandparents, and you get to see your mom and dad. They're due a visit anyway." Lorelei didn't look relieved, but at least satiated for the moment. Mason figured it was the fact that they were going to her parents that made her that way. She hadn't seen them for a long time, and though her relationship with them had been strained since she and Mason had married, she still brought up the idea of Catherine getting to know her grandparents, especially during the holidays. "Where did you put the stuff for Catherine?" Mason asked. By the front door, she answered. Mason spent the next 10 minutes going from the house to the van, transferring first the baby supplies, and then what food stores they had in the house, and anything else he could think of as essential. When the inside of the van looked like a storage unit packed from the seats to the rear doors with 1,000 unique items, Mason got into the driver's seat and started the engine. He and Lorelei looked at each other, she sitting on the floor of the van in between the two bucket seats, her right hand resting on the bottle that was in Catherine's mouth as the baby sucked contentedly away. Lorelei looked at the house. "Do you lock the door?" she asked. Mason looked surprised for a second. "I'm not sure. I don't think so," answered Mason. Lorelei continued looking at the home, thinking, "I guess if we're back tomorrow, it will be okay." Mason nodded. If not, it wouldn't matter. He put the van into reverse and backed out. He drove away from the house. The neighborhood was dark, almost pitch black except for starlight. They made their way to I-15 and then south to Springville. The journey took most of the night as the main highway, and then the surface roads were all cluttered with stalled vehicles and many crashes. During the journey, Mason had thought many times about the events of the day and how quickly everything had changed. The fabric of society, which he had known since birth, tore to pieces as quickly as a candle being blown out. A flame that had burned with intensity was now cold gone, as if extinguished with an east wind.